Hello everybody. We're going to have a look at the second topic, exception handling. It's actually not just handling, but it's also raising an exception. This is an extremely important topic. It helps us with incorrect input from the user. Okay, we're going to discuss the following topics. First of all, why we use exceptions. We're going to have a look at some examples of exceptions that you would have encountered most probably in the past. Then we're going to have a look at a bit of theory from Microsoft. We're going to see how to handle the exceptions in a class, in an application, How to handle exceptions in an application. Then how a class will tell an application that there's a problem, so how to raise an exception in a class. And then we need to know exception execution. What would happen during the execution of an application? Really well. Okay, so exceptions. What's an exception then, first of all? And why do we use it? So exceptions are objects as well, and they can carry a message. It's sent from one class to another, and we use it when something went wrong, so that the one class can tell the other something went wrong. Remember, the form in an application is also a class. So normally we're going to use them when a class tells an application something went wrong. Examples of exceptions that you would have encountered before. Oh, this we would have definitely experienced. If the user enters non-numeric data, and we require numeric data, so integer or double, my program can't handle that. Another example that you would most probably have encountered would be when the array index would be out of bounds, less than or bigger than the values that are valid for the index subscript. We're going to see how to handle exceptions with the try-catch statement and what influence that would have on the flow of control in the program. And then we're going to see how to raise an exception in a class, in the set property or in a method if a validation would have failed. Do remember that we always include a good description for the exception. Let's have a look at one or two practical examples first. So this is an example of a first year program. We get an amount and we can see we're going to display a tax. If we go have a look at the actual code, there's a nice description, so it's rather easy to figure out. The user needs to enter an amount in a text box. We calculate some tax amount from it and then display it. If this program is executed, then the following happens. If the user gives me good data, so 100 for example, tax is calculated and all is fine. The moment though that the user's finger might slip and 77t, let's go for a lowercase t, is entered, we click on calculate tax, my program stops. Stops on line 20 and it says invalid cast exception was unhandled. This line over here is important. It says conversion from string 77t to type decimal is not valid. And this is then the first example of an exception, and I'm quite sure you would have encountered this quite a few times before. I need to stop the program. Program can't continue. Convert to decimal is a function coded in VB. So what we are actually doing here is to send a string to the function, and this function will convert the string to a decimal, give back the value, and we save that. When convert to decimal, the function can't do its job. Can't take the string and convert it to a decimal. That's when it's going to tell us, oops, I've got a problem. And it does that with an exception. It raises an exception, so the line that gave the problem, and it would normally be a function call or something like that, procedure call as well. That line is the point where the program stops. The program looks for a specific set of statements to say, oh, if you encounter a problem, do this or do that. Now, we didn't include it over here, so the program couldn't handle the exception. My application will always handle the exception. The exception was raised by this convert to decimal function. So exceptions are normally raised by functions and procedures in classes, and my application must handle it. So this is the first example that I just want to show you. Before we handle it, I want to give you a second example. Let's say we ask the user for a number of names. We want to ask the user how many names must be stored. Over here is a loop to get all the data, and then a second loop to display all the data. I just declared an array without creating it. After we get the number of names that the user wants to store, we can create the array with the specified data. The readm statement over here uses the index. And over here I've opened tutorials point where they explain the readm statement. So have a look. We use readm. We can use the preserved keyword. We'll see why now. The name of the array and the subscripts that we need. Okay, so not the highest index, the number of subscripts. So preserve says if you change an array to a different size, preserve the current data in it. Okay, so if I go back to my code, we ask the user for how many names to store. We need to convert that to a subscript. So if the user tells me 3 names, we need until subscript 2, 0, 1, and 2. Over here I've got some code to get all the names from the user. I'm just going to fix the error from now. And some code to display all the names in the list box. So if I were to execute this, how many names do we want to store? 3. Sue, Mickey, and Mouse. And there we get the Sue. So the first loop got the data from me, and the second loop displays it. Now, if I make a mistake with my statements, so I ask the second loop to go from position 0 to array names.length, not length minus 1, the following is going to happen. So again, we can ask the user for number of names, and we can enter here whatever we want to. So first name, Sue, we've got Mickey, we've got Mouse, and we've got Pluto. He's dog. As soon as I'm finished with the input array, the second array will execute. And over here I've got a problem again. Now it says index out of range exception was unhandled. The index was outside the bounds of the array. Why? My loop statement was wrong, eh? I need to go from 0 to length minus 1 if I want to display all the data in the array. This subscript went from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, which were the valid values, and then it went to position 4 as well. And position 4 wasn't valued, or wasn't valid. We couldn't save the data. So over here we had two examples of exceptions that you would have encountered before. First of all, when the user enters non-numeric data and we require numeric data. So over here it's the user's fault. The user made some kind of an error. Second, this was the programmer's fault. Hey? Programmers should know that a loop for an array goes from 0 up until length minus 1 if I want to display all the data in the array. I'm going to become a little bit technical now. I'm going to have a look at the exception class in the .NET environment. So they say an exception class represents an error that occurred. That's the first important thing. Exception represents an error. If I scroll a little bit down, they're going to tell me that I can use a catch block to handle exceptions. And in this example, we can actually see that there's two catch blocks. A try catch statement would be the statement that we are going to use to handle an exception in an application. So we're going to add it to the other two applications just now. The code that might and might not give the exception would be entered in the try section. And now we can make provision for different kinds of exceptions. With beginners, we're really just going to say any general exception, like that. Later on, development software 2.2 definitely, we're going to make provision for different exceptions that can be handled by the application. So, exception is the class, that's the basis for all exceptions. When an error occurs, either the system or the currently executing application reports that error by throwing an exception that contains information about the error. After an exception is thrown, it's handled by the application or the default exception handler. So you guys will stop at handled by the application. So in this section, they can have a look at errors and exceptions, the try catch blocks, the types of exceptions, and some properties. We're going to have a look at the theory a little bit more. They say runtime errors occur for various reasons. However, not all errors should be handled as exceptions in your code. These different categories, and we're going to respond to them. So first of all, there's usage errors. And they say a usage error represents an error in the programming logic that can result in an application. This should not be addressed through exception handling, but modifying the faulty code. Very important. So did we see something like this? Yes, with the arrays program. If I go to the erase program, faulty code can give me a problem. Faulty code can give me an exception. So I'm not going to add anything over here. We are going to fix the faulty code, and I've done that already by changing the maximum limit of the subscript of the index. And this solves the problem. Problem is gone. We can run the program. We want to enter 4 names. So we go for Sue, Mickey, Mouse, and Pluto. And voila, we've got the names. Programs works perfectly fine now. And we can stop this type of program. Close it. We don't need to look at it again. Okay, so first type of error, usage error. Programmer caused the error. Programmer's code is bad. So fix your bad code that gives the error. If I scroll down a little bit, then we get program errors. It's a runtime error that can't really be avoided by writing bug-free code. And this would now be something like the user entered incorrect data. At this stage, for you guys, that's beginners. So we need to handle that, and I'm going to show you just now. Then we get system failures. So this can now be anything from the network went down, so my application can't access the database, or program the specific PC's memory got a little bit full. We can't handle these. We're not going to make provision for them. At this stage, we're not going to do anything. If something like that happens, my program can't fix the network that went down. So we are only interested in program errors, normally caused by the user. We're then going to use try-catch blocks to handle the exceptions, to make a place for the exception to execute. And if something goes wrong, there's a section of code that says, and if something goes wrong, go do this. So we just need to remember the following. We need some human readable text to describe the error, so the user needs to know what went wrong. Exceptions then carries a call stack that the programmer can later use. We're not going to use this immediately with beginners. So for now, the message property of an exception is really, really important. We then get different properties. We're only really going to use the message property. There's just some performance considerations that we need to have a look at a later stage. The only other thing that I want to explain to you is this part where they tell us to choose standard exceptions. So when we throw an exception, when we raise an exception, we can often use an existing type for the exception in the .NET framework. When a parameter is wrong, we can really very often raise an argument exception. The type of exception must match more or less the thing that went wrong. But for now, with you guys, we're just going to use the base class that's called exception. We're not going to go into all the different exception types that's available. So if I first of all go have a look at the VB program then, to add some exception handling, we're going to do the following. I'm going to type try, press enter, and all the code that would normally execute, that would give me an exception, or anything after that that must execute if there's no problem will go into the try cap part. The catch part over here, this is now the little hand that catches the exception. If an exception is raised there, this will catch it, and over here we're just going to display a message. So I've got message box.show. Normally I start with the word error. These are exceptions, but users doesn't know that. Error, and I already know what went wrong. Hey, I can say please enter an amount in the text box. And I can go a little bit further. Let's just go to a new line. I can tell the user I want a new line first of all, and then I want the exception message. Every exception should carry a nice message. Now there's some code that I want to show you. This we got by default from the exception. So the exception object would be called EX. This works exactly the same as a parameter, a value parameter that we've got. So I can say give me the message. Can display the message as well. This class convert, or this function convert to decimal. If it can't convert the data, it's going to give me a message. And over here, I'm displaying the message on a new line to the user in my dialog box. So now if I run the code, following happens. First of all is fine. No problem at all. No dialog message appears. If I enter 77T, click there, I simply get a dialog. Please enter an amount in the text box. And they tell me there, this is the more technical conversion message. Conversion from string 77T to type decimal is not valid. I like to add that right at the bottom. So we can go clear. Maybe the user only wanted 77. And there we've got the tags for that. Two important things that you need to notice. First of all, if the amount is good, only line 21, 22, 23 executes. We don't see a text box, an error message. Second of all, if there was a problem, no tax amount is displayed. We can't go and calculate that because the amount that we use is invalid. If I go change this to 100 and an R, again, just the message is displayed. So, program execution. If all is well, those three lines get executed. The moment we've got a problem, control jumps immediately to the exception. Execute that. If the user clicks OK, that's the end of the event procedure in any case. Okay, so we're not going to include the two lines that calculate the tax after the end try. We don't want to do this if there was an exception. If we include it over here and there's an exception, program will display this, and then it's going to do those, and then it only finds end sub. That we don't want to do. So I'm going to move that code to its original place. All my code, the code that might raise the exception, as well as the code that works with the data, hey, must go into the try block. So either all three of the statements are done, if there's no exception, or if there's an exception, the rest of the statements are skipped. Control immediately jump to the catch, display the message, go to end try, end the sub procedure, because we didn't code anything there. Okay, so to add a try catch, to add exception handling, and I'm only going to do that in my application, really important, only the application. It's try, the catch part gets the message, and all the normal code goes over there. And we're not going to worry about the type of exception, we just use the basic exception that's given to us in VB. Okay, so that's the first part that you need to know. What are exceptions? They are little messages that's sent if something went wrong. A class or the methods in the class, or over here a function might raise an exception, might send the exception to you. Very often if parameter data would be invalid, and in this case if the string that we get from the text box is not valid, it's going to give me an exception. I don't do really anything but to display an error to the user. Nice and descriptive, and this part would be optional for you, that's just better. We give a little bit more technical message to the user on the second line. And voila, guess what? We know how to handle exceptions. We also know about the flow of control, because I've explained to you carefully that either those statements would be executed if all went well, and this part would be skipped then, or if this line gave an error, control will skip line 22 and 23, immediately jump to that line. So it's really important that you have a look at that and that you understand that. Okay, so lastly, regarding exceptions, we need to know how to raise an exception in a class. We already know how to handle the exception in an application. Try statement. So in a class, first of all, where will I raise an exception? And there's two places. In the set property, or in a method if a validation has failed. So either a validation that's failed in a set property, or if a validation failed in a method. We're always going to include a good description for the application. Let's go and open program 46 from the previous lesson. So previously we said don't do anything if the validation failed. So only assign the data if it's good. Now we can add the part that says, and if the data is bad, so else throw new exception, and we're going to include a message. Okay, so this part, you know, it's creating an object, and that part, you know, here we're calling the constructor. Hey, so there we're creating an object, and the throw part just says send back. So I'm just going to add a nice description over here. The name is too short. I just close some sections that I don't need. The new exception, the name is too short. I can include it must be at least 3 characters long. if the ID isn't the right length, again, I can add else. Throw new exception. The ID must be 13 characters long. If the balance isn't valid, I can add else. Throw new exception. The balance may not be negative. So, simply a nice message. And this part that says throw, it's a statement that says send back to where you were called. Important. Over here we use the properties. So that means that part will execute. If something is wrong, the exception would be raised. In buy goods, we can do the same. Remember, in the set properties and in the methods, that's got to do some validation. So over here, something like throw new exception. The purchase amount may not be negative. Sorry, that's now Zim that's helping me code. May not be negative. So Zimmy, my pet cockatiel, got a little bit bored and he thought, no, it's nice to go to have a pick at the mouse, and the mouse jumped to a different position. So if I go to the last place, I will add an else, throw new exception, and over here something like the payment amount may not be negative. Okay, so that's all I do. In all the set methods, set properties, where I need to validate data, and in all the methods where I need to validate data in the class. If something is wrong, I simply go and say, raise an exception, throw a new exception, and I go include some nice message for the exception. Last thing for me to do would be to add now the exception handling in the application. So we only have a form 1. First place where we might get an exception is if the user enters data that's not good. So that means have the definition of the variables and then try, and then all the statements that you'd normally have for saving goes over there. And all I do at this stage, if there was a problem on the application, I need to tell the user message box dot show, and I start with error. And now I'm not too sure what went wrong. Was it the name or the ID? The name or the ID? That's why I can use message. Okay, so if I'm just going to include that part for now, run the application. I have one character there, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Click save, and I get a message. Error, the name is too short. It must be at least 3 characters long. Now this part comes directly from my class. It's my message. It's only the word error that I've added in front. If I now include Sue, but I will have Let's delete 2 of those ID number characters. Error. The ID must be 13 characters long. Okay, if I now go to the code where the client would buy on account, then again there might be problems, but now there might be 2 problems, because first of all the amount might have not been a numeric value. Second of all, buy goods might not have been happy with the amount. So I can include a try over here. Again, I'm going to move all this code there, and all I do is to say message box dot show. I start with error, and I would rather now just go and say ex.message. Give me the error that you got. Maybe a colon like this. So now if it's incorrect data, or if it's buy goods that gave her the problem. Let's go and test the code. So we've got Sue with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 characters. Here we go. If we go to buy on account, if I enter 10 like that, we simply get a message. Conversion from string 10 to type decimal is not valid. Can't do that part. If I go buy again, but this time 100, it's processed, all is fine. If I go buy again, but this time minus 60, I get an error. The purchase amount may not be negative. We can let this message box look nice and neat with all kinds of icons. The basic one is good enough for now. So now the purchase amount may not be negative. This message comes from my class. And we can do exactly the same then where the client pays the account. So all my variable definitions, that's fine. Line open, try, press enter, move all this code to the try block. And over here, just going to be a nice lazy programmer. Copy and paste. To do exactly the same, because again, and this is now the nice thing about exception for beginners. Anything that went wrong, it's going to just display an error message for me. So, biggest normally thing that beginners struggle with is to remember the class will throw the exception. We can also call raise the exception. The application will have the try catch statement to handle the exception. Okay, beginners get a little bit confused between what goes where. So remember, in the class we're always going to throw the exception, normally in an if, when some validation fails. So I'm going to test something with an if statement. If the data is bad, throw new exception and a message. In the application, I make provision for the exception. I need to handle the exception. I've got a try catch statement over there. Okay, hope this is good. We're going to see a full example just now in topic 3, program 51. Thank you. So to recap just quickly, we had a look at why we use exceptions, so that the class can let the application know some data went wrong. Examples of exceptions: non-numeric input data, array out of bounds. We saw that array out of bounds must be handled by the programmer. If the user gives me bad data, I can test for that with a try-catch statement. We had a look at some exception theory from Microsoft. We saw how to handle exceptions, very importantly in an application. And then we saw how to raise an exception in a class. And we also had a look at the execution when an exception is raised in the application itself. In the class, what's going to happen if this pay account method gets a negative amount? It tests. It will automatically go to else, so it's not going to increase the balance. And then it's going to raise this exception, and the exception will stop this sub-procedure immediately. So important, I mustn't go and add this code in the wrong place. My logic must be good over here. The moment that we get to this throw, the method stops, goes back to where it was called from. Okay, hope this is helpful. Thank you.